Hi, this is Scott, and it's been a long time since I've made a YouTube video, and I'm not really thinking this is going to be a regular thing or anything at the moment, but I just wanted to make a sort of like a little video explaining one of my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh decks, because I'm into Yu-Gi-Oh now. I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh kind of casually and a little bit competitively, wanting to play it more competitively, but this is not a competitive deck profile. This is just a kind of video that is introducing and talking a little bit about one of my favorite decks currently, the Weather Painters. They're not anywhere close to meta, but they're a lot of fun to play, and they use some mechanics of the game in a really interesting way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those mechanics before we start. So I've got my mat here with zones on it because it's important to know your zones when playing Weather Painters. So there's two main things to know about the Weather Painters. One, that the Weather Painter monster cards each have an effect that when they are banished by a weather spell, then they will special summon themselves back to the field during the standby phase. Now, each of the weather spells or traps banishes a Weather Painter card for basically its cost. And so then the Weather Painters summon themselves back at the next standby phase. But the way that the weather spells and traps work is that they give the effect to all Weather Painter monsters in the zones in the zones in the same column and adjacent columns. So when I activate the snowy canvas here in the center spell and trap zone, it's going to be giving its effect to all of the Weather Painter cards in these zones, the ones adjacent to it, so these zones, and then the one in the center. So hopefully that makes sense, but we're going to get into talking about the cards, and it might make a little bit more sense as I start talking about how they work. So we start with 3 of the Weather Painter Snow. This is effectively the deck's starter card, as it allows you to place a weather spell or trap directly from the deck face up into a spell and trap zone when normal summoned. So you normal summon Snow, and you basically get any weather spell and trap that you need from the deck. Very useful, pretty powerful. It's a great starter for the deck. Then we get into 3, the Weather Painter Thunder. So now, one thing about Snow is that Snow has 0 attack. So Snow is not going to advance your win condition very much, apart from setting you up. The other Weather Painter monsters fortunately have attack, but it's relatively low. Thunder with 1700 is honestly one of the higher ones that doesn't take a tribute to summon. And Thunder has the also very useful effect to send a continuous spell or trap from your spell and trap zones to the graveyard, and then you can set face up a weather spell or trap directly from the deck. So once again, this allows you to get directly from your deck a spell or trap face up, ready to use, which is, again, very powerful. Thunder puts in a lot of work, especially changing out cards that you no longer need or don't need for a card that you do need. Next up is 2 Cloud. So Cloud is effectively the deck's sort of the way to recur resources, because you see, once the spells or traps are off the field, well, you're going to need to get them back, and the Cloud allows you to do that. When another weather card is sent to the graveyard, you can target 2 weather spells or traps in your graveyard, place them face up in the spell and trap zone. So it's almost like a 1 for 2. So you can send 1, get 2. It's a great way to recur resources either late in the game, because this deck is a control deck, which means that you're not going to win games with an OTK. You're going to win games by grinding your opponent out, denying them resources, and preventing them from playing the game. Our next one is 1 Sun. Sun is the only Weather Painter that really has like an inherent special summoning condition. Sun is when he's in the graveyard and you can send a continuous spell trap you control to the graveyard, special summon this card in defense position, and if you do, you can place a weather spell trap from your hand in the face-up spell and trap zone. So this allows you to get weather cards out of your hand and another body on the field for plays, which can be very useful, especially when trying to go into the boss monster of the deck, which we'll talk about very shortly. Perhaps the most important Weather Painter in the entire deck is Aurora. And you really only have room for 1 Aurora, but At the same time, protecting your Aurora and keeping her on the field is crucial, because Aurora prevents your weather spells and traps from being targeted or destroyed by card effects, which is significant, because when your opponent activates Cosmic Cyclone, Twin Twisters, any number of spell and trap destruction, if you don't have Aurora, then you're going to have Cloud to recur those resources. Aurora will prevent those cards from being destroyed entirely, which is, again, crucial to the deck strategy, because without your spell and trap cards, you can't really play the game. Aurora's trouble, though, is that she is a level 6 monster, which means she cannot be normal summoned. She really needs to be special summoned by the effect of a card, or tribute summoned if you're desperate. Aurora does have the really nice normal summon effect that if you do tribute summon her, you can get any weather spell trap from your deck, graveyard, or hand onto the field immediately, which is pretty good, but you really don't want to normal summon this monster. There's a better way to get her on the field. So those are the weather monsters. 3 snow, 3 thunder, 2 cloud, 1 sun, and 1 aurora. There is one more relevant weather painter monster, which is rain. I currently don't play rain, but I'm strongly considering it. Rain, when special summoned, allows you to set a weather spell or trap from your hand, which can be very useful both late and early game to get spells and traps on the field and immediately live. I'm considering playing 1, and there's a flex slot in the deck that is for her, should I choose to play her. Now for the hand traps, because you do need hand traps for this deck to function in order to slow your opponent down enough that you can make your plays. I'm currently doing 3 Ash, 3 Ogre, and 3 Infinite Impermanence. Now obviously, Infinite Impermanence is a very expensive card. I would advise that if you're on a budget, you could go for Effect Failure instead. I went for Impermanence because Impermanence is more versatile and more powerful in that it cannot be called by the grave, that a lot of cards that stop hand traps do not stop Impermanence, and it's a very solid card. Once it gets a little bit cheaper, I'd recommend picking these up. Now, if you're wondering why Ash, why Ogre, one of the things that I think about, while Ash is in general one of the best hand traps just because stopping searches is extremely powerful, well, one of the things about Ogre is that this deck can struggle at getting things off the field for good. In other words, getting it to the graveyard to where it can't come back. And I know graveyard recursion is a thing, but usually this deck deals with threats by bouncing them, which is great for extra deck monsters, but for sometimes main deck monsters, just destroying them to deny your opponent the resource is a little bit better way to go. All right, so now we're going to talk about the weather spells and traps. So we're running 3 Snowy Canvas. Now, Snowy Canvas is certainly one of the most useful ones throughout the game because it allows you to banish a weather painter and then search your deck for a weather card and add it to your hand, which is pretty potent. Because it will get you really any resource that you need. It will get you your other spells and traps, and searching this thing out is always advised, whether by the effect of thunder or snow. Running 1 Rainy Canvas. This one is a little bit more niche in its uses as it balances spells and traps back to your opponent's hand. I find this to be pretty useful in the end phase or in the battle phase where your opponent cannot easily reset these cards back on the field. So if they have a problematic field spell, or you know that they're setting a powerful trap for your turn, just go ahead and bounce that back into the hand in the end phase, so that way they cannot use that. Or, of course, if you're going second, bouncing them early into the turn can often force them out, and in situations that maybe your opponent doesn't want them to. This one is very situational, so it's one that you sort of search depending on the matchup, or maybe you discard it, send it to the graveyard to search out a more useful weather spell. Alright, then for the traps, 2 Thundery Canvas. Thundery Canvas is perhaps one of the most powerful weather cards, as it acts as non-targeting, non-destructing removal for basically any threat that the deck could possibly go up against. This turns your 0-attack snows into instant removal for any problem card. Your opponent sets up Avermax. This gets rid of Avermax. Your opponent sets up Dragoon. This gets rid of Dragoon. I mean, you'll have to hopefully not get negated on the way, but either way, things that are immune to destruction, things that are immune to targeting, Thundery Canvas doesn't care about that. This activates during the damage step, so it's also hard to counter in the damage step because that's where a lot of cards and effects just can't be activated. Thundery Canvas is very powerful and is great for just removing problem cards that you need to get off the field. Wait for your opponent to invest a lot of resources into a big extra deck monster, bounce it back to the extra deck, and make them waste those resources. And then we're running 2 Rainbowed Canvas. I really wish they had released this in foil. Rainbowed Canvas allows you to, when your opponent controls a monster, banish a weather monster to special summon a weather monster from the deck. Now, this is how you get Aurora on the field, because since she costs a tribute, Rainbow Canvas will get her from the deck to the field very easily. Now, one thing to remember about all of the weather cards is that they're basically all quick effects in that, well, I mean, it's apart from Thundery Canvas and that it only activates during the damage step, but might as well be a quick effect at that point. They're all quick effects, so you can use them during your opponent's turn to, one of my favorite uses is, say your opponent targets a weather card for, with a card that destroys. Let's say Sky Striker Afterburners, for instance. You can banish to remove that target to sort of make the card fizzle and no longer have a target to destroy. Alright, so now let's talk about the generic stuff, the things that any deck could run. Since this deck does not rely on the extra deck whatsoever, Pot of Extravagance is an easy choice for this. Extravagance is extremely vital at generating advantage. And again, I want to stress, you do not need the extra deck. You don't even really need the deck's boss monster to win most games. Banishing those 6 cards, not a big deal. You will never really go into extra deck plays with this deck. It just does not. It's not how the deck really works. So Extravagance is a great choice. This card is much more affordable now at $20 or so per copy as of the recording of this video. So grab your copies of Extravagance while you can, or else you'll have to wait for another reprint. So when I talked about that flex slot that I was considering the Weather Painter Rain for, I'm running currently 1 Pot of Duality. Duality is okay in this deck early on in the game because you're not going to be special summoning a lot. Very early into the game, you're going to be just simply normal summoning 1 monster, setting up back row, and then generating advantage throughout the game. So Duality is a pretty decent card in those early stages of the game, but I'm finding that it does conflict with some of the strategies that I like to play with this deck to get more monsters on the field more quickly. So I'm thinking about replacing it with another Weather Painter card, Rain specifically. But Duality can work in the deck, don't get me wrong. If you cannot afford Extravagance, Duality is not a bad option as a backup. Now this is probably one of my favorite cards in the deck, and that is Valhalla, Hall of the Fallen. So the Weather Painters are fairy monsters, which means that once per turn, you can special summon a fairy-type monster from your hand. You must control no monsters to activate and resolve this effect. Now, that's a pretty easy condition to fulfill, considering that you can activate Valhalla, special summon, say, Thunder, for instance, and Thunder hits the field. Then you can use Thunder's effect to replace Valhalla with Snowy Canvas. Then you can banish Thunder for the effect of Snowy to search out Snow. Then you can still normal summon Snow because you haven't used your normal summon yet. Valhalla enables a lot of plays for this deck that allow it to get more monsters and more spells and traps on the field a lot more quickly. Since Valhalla is a continuous spell or trap, it synergizes very nicely with a lot of the effects of Weather Painter monsters. I think it's a great card in the deck. I've enjoyed using it a lot. I wouldn't say it's vital for the deck. You can play without it. You can put in Solemn Strike, for instance, as another option, or you can put in more. You could put in some Torrential Tribute, something like that. I just really like this deck because it enables it to get started a lot more quickly and get more monsters on the field. Now let's talk about Solemn Judgement. Judgment is an extremely powerful card, as everybody should know who plays Yu-Gi-Oh! Negating really any kind of summon, spell or trap effects is just significantly powerful. You must pay half your life points, which is not that big of a deal, because a lot of times you can easily summon things in defense position or get around the battle step entirely with Thundery Canvas, so you shouldn't be losing too many life points with this deck. But Solemn Judgement is a powerful blowout card that I highly recommend for the deck. You can also run Strike. Strike is very good too. You can even run both. I'm running Judgment at the moment, and I find it very, very powerful. All right. Now, the last 3 slots of the deck are the blowout cards. These are, if you draw these cards, a lot of times your opponent must out these cards in order to continue playing. So we're doing 1 Dimensional Fissure. All of these cards are limited to 1. Because any monster sent to the graveyard is banished instead, this deck just doesn't care about that, because either things are going to be on the field or they're going to be in the banish zone, ready to be summoned on the next standby phase. So Fissure is not a big deal to play around. And in that same vein, we're also running 1 Macrocosmos, because forcing cards to be banished instead of the graveyard can completely shut down some decks. And I think that these cards are very useful for, I guess, forcing your opponent to deal with them over your weather cards. So these become prime targets for Twin Twisters, a Cosmic Cyclone, etc. Now, the last card in the deck is probably the one that is the most powerful and is the most interesting interactions with the way the deck works, and that is Skill Drain. So you might be thinking, you know, oh, Skill Drain, well, that's going to negate your effects too, right? Well, not necessarily. So again, the weather spells and traps are the spell effect giving the monster an effect. So these effects are technically not monster effects. Your weather painters can still use the effects of the canvas cards while Skill Drain is on the field. This leads to some very oppressive scenarios for your opponent where you can just generate a significant amount of advantage with the weather painter cards in order to, you know, and while you're also completely shutting down your opponent's plays. It's very potent, and it's flipping Skill Drain in this deck can easily win games. And that seems a little bit ridiculous to say, because flipping Skill Drain can win games in a lot of other decks. But I guess for me, in the weather painters, it's just, it affects you so little, which I think is incredible that the deck can play like that. A lot of fun to just totally lock out your opponent in that way. Not fun for them, though. Okay, so now, I'm hesitant to call this a deck profile because I'm not really profiling like a deck that I would actually recommend you play, because I'm doing some things with the extra and side deck which are very unconventional and are mostly for the purpose of allowing me to try out this deck in a lot of different modes. Now, what I mean with all that is that what I've done is that the weather painters are not just good on their own. What you've seen is kind of what I'd call pure weather painters. But the weather painters actually synergize very nicely with the very infamous Numeron engine. Now, before you click away at the mere mention of Numeron, hear me out. So what I've done here is that the extra deck right now has 3 Weather Painter Rainbow, which I'll talk about shortly. 1 Boral Sword Dragon for the off-handed chance that you'd need this to win. It's something I would probably never summon, but it is a thing. And then the rest of the cards in the extra deck is the full Numeron engine. The full Numeron engine isn't here. And with an Infinite Track Fortress Megaclops, just again on the off chance that actually is relevant. Now, why is it like that? Well, it's because the side deck for the deck is effectively 3 Veilers for additional hand traps, and then the entire Numeron engine. So what am I doing with this? Well, I'm basically just testing how well this deck performs in both pure versions and Numeron versions. And the way the deck is set up right now allows me to do that in a set format with at locals. It's just, you know, it's kind of a fun thing for locals. Well, not fun for my opponent when they get Zexaled, but it's interesting how you can easily fit the entire Numeron engine into the extra and side deck, which are 2 things that the deck doesn't really need, allowing you to, if the occasion calls for, you can completely convert the deck into a sort of like Weather Painter Numeron strategy with very little disruption to the deck's core engine. So Numeron Weather Painter has the advantage of basically being able to lock your opponent out of the first several turns of the game while you build up a powerful board and an extensive board presence, which should allow you more easily to go into the deck's boss monster and perhaps the most powerful Weather Painter of all, Rainbow. So, what is Rainbow? Weather Painter Rainbow is a wild card because from the extra monster zone, she has 3 arrows pointing down, so to these 3 zones, alright? So, Rainbow, to the monsters that she's pointing to, she effectively gives an Omni-Negate effect to. When a card effect is activated, quick effect, you can banish this card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy the card. So, Omni-Negate, which is crazy powerful. The problems with Rainbow come in a few categories. First off, the materials, the weather monsters, that actually can be kind of difficult to summon for this deck. Because giving up 3 weather monsters means that you need to have backup weather monsters to act as Rainbow's Omni-Negates. I wouldn't feel comfortable summoning Weather Painter Rainbow unless I had 5 Weather Painters on the field. Because you'll also need to keep Aurora, and then you'll need to have at least 1 other Weather Painter monster to keep on the field as a negate. So Rainbow is tough to summon. Here in the on the card, it also mentions that Rainbow can be used as effectively a judgment for the summons. You can, when your opponent would special summon a monsters, you can send this link summon card to the graveyard and negate the summon if you do destroy the monster. Now, she also has the condition that she can summon herself back when banished for a weather monster effect. But what I find is that when she's in the extra monster zone, she can't really use those effects. The Weather Painter, the canvas cards really seem to only affect the ones in the columns that are not the extra monster zone, which means that Rainbow won't really get much benefit. That's not an effect that's going to really be super relevant. The main effects of Rainbow that are relevant are the Omni Negate and then the Summon Negate. Because she can completely shut your opponent down if you actually manage to get this card out. It kind of seems like a win more card, but sometimes the games grind long enough that Rainbow will close it out, because when Rainbow hits the field, your opponent cannot activate really anything without getting it negated. So one last thing for the deck, in talking about how Numeron works with it. Numeron does a couple of things for the deck. For one, Memories of Hope is a draw 4, which is outrageous. You know, resolving Memories of Hope is insane card advantage, which can really help the deck. Numeron Network's condition to activate, Calling's effect to activate is very easy to resolve, because if you simply banish your weather monsters, then they're not on the field. So you can activate Network, summon Zexal, and then summon your Weather Painters back in the standby phase, while also negating or shutting down your opponent's cards. Does the Numeron engine have weaknesses? Absolutely. But I find that the Weather Painters sort of can help make up for those weaknesses, because the Weather Painters do a great job at recurring resources and trying to stick on the field and having... and since they can easily remove themselves from the field, it's very possible to resolve Numeron Network halfway or late into a game by simply banishing all of your Weather Painter monsters and then activating the Numeron engine. So that is effectively my video on the Weather Painters. I think they're a really fun archetype. You might be thinking, oh wow, an archetype that works really well with Numeron, how thrilling. Well, I just think that as far as control archetypes go, the Weather Painters are really unique, and that they do things and interact with the game in ways that that are distinctive. I also really like the Mech Knights, and I think column-based mechanics are a really cool idea in Yu-Gi-Oh! I would love to see more archetypes work with columns. And yeah, I think Weather Painters are really cool. The more that I play the deck, I might update this with some new kinds of sort of what I think is maybe the optimal Weather Painter build, whether it's Numeron or Pure or some other variant. But yeah, overall, I hope this was informative and enjoyable for you to listen to. Yeah. go Weather Painters. They're not that expensive. Snow is pretty much the most expensive card in the deck at about $10, which is a little bit pricey, but I guess Extravagance is pretty expensive too, but you don't have to have Extravagance. Extravagance is just very recommended. Well, I guess Impermanence. But again, you don't have to have Impermanence. Veiler works just fine. Anyway, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for watching, and see you till next time.